Chapter 9D. This is the first of what I like to call a supplemental tangent, material not really covered in the textbook that I feel a proper cinema survey of this time period really should address. I will have one of these for each chapter. This tangent is about the 1950s. By the way, the case studies at the end of each chapter are not on your quizzes or tests. Some of them are more interesting than others. You might choose to read them, but they will not be on your tests. I will be discussing 3 topics. Number 1, the so-called Hollywood 10 or blacklist. Number 2, the rise of method acting. And number 3, 2 actors who died too young, James Dean and Marilyn Monroe. Though technically she died in 1961. I think they go together, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Number 1. The 1950s is often remembered fondly as a simpler time, a time of post-war economic prosperity, as previously discussed, with expansion into the suburbs, the baby boom, and the Howdy Doody show sponsored by Wonder Bread, synthetic white bread, black and white television. But the 1950s were more complicated than that. In the post-war era, the United States and the Soviet Union, who had been allies during World War II, became both military and political rivals in what would come to be known as the Cold War. The threat of the spread of communism became an issue of national security, and anyone with what could be considered communist leanings was suddenly suspicious. The House Un-American Activities Committee, later chaired by Senator Joseph McCarthy, was charged with investigating allegations of communist influence and subversion. Hollywood, with its lax attitudes and questionable morals, was seen as a hotbed of communist activity, and certain anti-communist legislators started to look for subversive propaganda in movies and later television. In October 1947, more than 40 individuals from the film industry were subpoenaed to appear in Washington, D.C. on suspicion of holding communist loyalties or being involved in subversive activities. To be brought before the committee was a stain on one's reputation in an era where that still mattered. And while some invoked their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, others saved themselves by incriminating others. But in November 1947, a group of 10 screenwriters and directors, known as the Hollywood 10, openly challenged the legitimacy of the committee's investigation, denounced the hearings as an outrageous violation of their civil rights, and refused to cooperate. They were cited for contempt of Congress and sentenced to a year in prison and a $1,000 fine each. Their efforts to appeal failed. One of the 10, Edward Dmytryk, cut his sentence short by cooperating with the committee by testifying and by providing 20 names of other communists in the industry. The studios, wanting to stay out of trouble, refused to employ anyone suspected of being a communist or a radical. The process of being disgraced during this era was known as the blacklist, until it finally ended in 1960. Some screenwriters were able to continue working under pseudonym, such as Dalton Trumbo, who worked as Robert Rich. But for the most part, such an accusation was the end of your career. I should mention that it was not just the entertainment industry under fire. McCarthy also suspected members of the State Department and the military of communist ties and would also bring them to testify before the committee. It is one of the darker episodes in American history, which President Truman referred to as the most un-American thing today in 1959. Number 2, method acting. Whether you took Cine 201 or not, you may have seen examples of film from the early days of silent movies to the development of sound and later color, where actors seem somewhat exaggerated, unnatural, like they are playing to the back of the room instead of projecting from within. You can never forget that they are acting. You never believe that they are the characters they are supposed to be. There was a recurring Saturday Night Live character played by Jon Lovitz called Master Thespian, advised by his mentor, the incomparable John Lithgow, in this clip in your folder, to say your lines with an ascending scale of volume and pitch until your final words ring nobly, then tremble while descending. That was the style. Before Konstantin Stanislavski of the Moscow Art Theater, who profoundly influenced a generation of acting teachers, including Lee Strasberg, Stella Adler, and Uta Hagen. In his method of physical actions, the actor performs a physical motion or a series of physical activities to create the desired emotional response for the character, which might involve digging into the actor's subconscious. There is a union between the physical and the psychological. Actions control emotions instead of emotions controlling actions. Stanislavski's system is associated with method acting, but it's not exactly the same thing. Method acting, which is an outgrowth of the New York theater scene of the 30s and 40s, appeared when actors and directors like Elia Kazan, Robert Lewis, and Strasberg, first in the group theater and later in the actor's studio, applied the emotional memory technique from the Stanislavski system. Adler, also a prominent acting teacher in New York, did not follow Strasberg's method and had herself been taught by Stanislavski. The system and the method are often confused because both techniques ask the actor to draw on a past experience or remembrance. Stanislavski has the actor ask himself, "What would I do if I were in this circumstance?" While Strasberg adopted a modification. What would motivate me, the actor, to behave in the way the character does? Strasberg asks actors to replace the play circumstances with their own, called a substitution. Stanislavski had, throughout his life, no single focused project. Instead, he thought of his system as a table of contents from which the working actor can constantly draw, depending on what problems might occur from play to play. Strasberg taught James Dean, Geraldine Page, Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, Maureen Stapleton, Jane Fonda, Anne Bancroft, and toward the end of her life, Marilyn Monroe. Adler taught Marlon Brando, Elizabeth Taylor, Robert De Niro, Warren Beatty, and so many others. My point is this: a different style of acting, whether it was officially method or not, was being seen on both stage and screen in the 1950s in some of the best works of the era. There's no denying that Brando became, let's say, unhinged in the last 20 years of his life and career, but in the 1950s there was no one else like him on screen. Brando won an Oscar for On the Waterfront, directed by Kazan, a crime drama about union violence and corruption among longshoremen. His performance as Terry Malloy has been called a tour de force, and the late critic Roger Ebert said that in this film, Brando and Kazan changed acting in American films forever. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody instead of a bum, which is what I am. James Dean had been a student of Lee Strasberg and gave a mostly unscripted performance in East of Eden, also directed by Kazan, though he is better remembered for Rebel Without a Cause. His Oscar nomination for East of Eden, however, was posthumous, since Dean had just been killed in a car accident at age 24. Number 3, 1950s icons, Marilyn and Jimmy Dean. Because he died young and had just played the role of Jim Stark in Rebel Without a Cause, a rebellious teenager who thinks no one could possibly understand him, James Dean became an icon of rebellious teenagers everywhere. Red leather jacket, white t-shirt, messy hair, smoldering eyes, expressed his emotions. And because he died before he got super famous, There wasn't a lot of evidence of him behaving badly to disappoint anyone who loved him. He is forever young and forever mysterious. He is remembered for the poster for Rebel Without a Cause, but he actually was a good actor. Though in his 20s when he died, he dressed like a teenager, and in an era where the boys didn't want to put on a suit like their dads, Dean was their role model. Meanwhile, Marilyn Monroe. Like James Dean, she died before her time, and her image lives on in the form of posters on dorm room walls. She died in 1961 from a drug overdose, allegedly, at the age of 36, but is of the same generation as Dean. She started as a model and turned to acting, and was frustrated that she wasn't taken more seriously. She was typecast as a dumb blonde after roles in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and The 7-Year Itch. She studied with several acting coaches to build her confidence, including Lee Strasberg and his wife Paula Strasberg at the Actors Studio. But her relationships with directors were frequently strained, especially Billy Wilder, who directed her in both The 7-Year Itch and Some Like It Hot. She struggled with depression, which at the time was misunderstood, and was uncomfortable with the type of celebrity she generated. She didn't want to be a celebrity. She wanted to be an actress. She is remembered more for her public persona than for her actual work, but some of her films, especially Some Like It Hot, are true treasures.